it's over the mountain and over the main, through Gibraltar to France and Spain. It's a feather to your bonnet and a kilt within your knee. And list, bonny laddie, and come awa with me, for it's over the mountain and over the main, through Gibraltar to France and Spain. It's a feather to your bonnet and a kilt within your knee. And list, bonny laddie, and come awa with me.
During the Middle Ages, Gaelic men in the Scottish Highlands and Ireland wore a lane, a long linen shirt, or tunic, dyed saffron yellow. However, in the late 16th century, in the Scottish Highlands, the Fairly More large wrap was adopted. This was a woolen blanket 4 to 5 yards long, usually worn over the shoulder and belted at the waist. The plaid had to be hand-pleated on the ground. The first description of Highlanders wearing what would become known as the Great Kilt, or belted plaid, is from 1594, about Scottish mercenaries fighting with the Irish. Highland women wore the airsaid, a longer and more dress-like style of great kilt. Before the 19th century, clan tartans did not exist. The tartan of someone's plaid or trews, which I'll discuss later, depended on their personal taste, along with the availability and cost of natural dyes. However, certain patterns were sometimes linked to particular regions. Although more subdued colours were sometimes favoured for camouflage, bright dyes were probably more common and fashionable. Contemporary illustrations show Highlanders wearing multiple different tartans at once. With the extra cloth, pockets in the belted plaid could be created to hold items. A sporran contained the Highlanders' oatmeal, firelighting kit, musket or pistol balls, and anything else that could fit into the small leather pouch. Over time, these became more ornate and less practical, as did the rest of the Highland dress. During the 18th century, Highland soldiers wore sporrans made of badger or otter fur, even beaver and raccoon in North America. Later, ceremonial military sporrans were made of horsehair with long tassels. These are still worn today. After the 45, the Dress Act prohibited the wearing of the kilt and other items of traditional Gaelic clothing north of the Highland line. This was a measure to suppress the warlike culture of the Highland clans, many of whom had sided with the Jacobites in the last 4 rebellions. Any man or boy caught wearing Highland dress faced draconian punishment, ranging from a severe fine to imprisonment or even deportation. By 1782, when this legislation was repealed, the kilt had changed drastically. Highlanders fighting in North America during the French and Indian War found the great kilt bulky and impractical for moving through dense forest, so when a soldier's plaid wore out, they were shortened into the philabeg, small wrap. This was the first step towards the modern tailored kilt with straps and buckles. The modern fly plaid is an imitation of how the old great kilt was worn over the shoulder. It would be incorrect to claim that all Highland men from 1600 to 1746 wore the belted plaid. Breeches, common in England and the Scottish Highlands, and trews were also worn by Highlanders. These garments were particularly helpful for Highland gentlemen who wanted to ride. Obviously, the great kilt was not ideal for sitting on a horse. Riders sometimes wore trews which were trimmed with leather on the inner leg to prevent them from wear by rubbing the saddle. Trews were completely different to modern tartan trousers, often wrongly labelled as trews. These were tight-fitting hose and were fastened beneath the leg with garters, similar to flashes worn with modern kilt hose. The tartan on trews was always at a diagonal. Eventually, trews were adopted by the British Army and simplified, as the kilt had been. Most Highland regiments wore the kilt, so trews became associated with Lowland regiments instead. This is misleading because these garments, and anything tartan, were originally Highland garb, while Lowlanders wore breeches. Kilt hose were made of wool, and before the invention of elasticated socks, needed to be held up with garters or flashes. These are now a decorative part of the modern Highland dress. In the modern day, hose are usually single solid colours. However, diced hose are still worn ceremonially in the military, and similar Gael hose are sometimes worn as civilian wear. Highland clansfolk often went around barefoot, even into the 19th century in some rural communities. When poor Highlanders did wear something on their feet, it was usually simple deerskin shoes or rawhide brogues, similar to Native American moccasins. These usually had holes cut in them to allow water to drain out after crossing a stream. They wore out quickly and needed frequent replacement. Modern ghillie brogues, worn with formal Highland dress, are descended from this old footwear and have laces that tie around the lower leg and kilt hose. wealthier Highlanders could afford to wear buckle shoes. In northern England and the Scottish Lowlands, the blue bonnet, or scone cap, descended from the Tudor bonnet, was worn from the late 1500s. In the 17th century, these knitted bonnets made of heavily felted wool and dyed blue or grey had spread to the Highlands. They could be scrugged into various shapes to keep off wind, rain or sun. During the 1600s, the blue bonnet became synonymous with the Covenanters, strict Presbyterians who fought against the interference of Charles I in the Kirk, the Church of Scotland. When adorned with the white cockade of Stuart in the 18th century, the bonnet became a symbol of Jacobitism. Like the kilt and trews, Highland headwear was greatly transformed in the British Army, and military fashion was later adopted by the civilian population. The Balmoral and Kilmarnock bonnets added ribbons and a turry. The ancestor of them had been plainer. Feather bonnets were adorned with a tuft of bear fur or ostrich feathers and a regimental hackle, being worn in the Napoleonic Wars. In 1914, at the start of World War I, Highlanders donned a Glengarry cap, which featured a diced border for some regiments. However, by 1915, the tam o' shanter, more reminiscent of old bonnets, replaced the Glengarry. This headwear was adorned with a regimental badge for identification. During the Irish War of Independence, the infamous Black and Tans wore tams, though only 14% of its members were Scottish. Scian dubh means black knife in Scots Gaelic, and this was because the handle was typically made of dark bogwood. They were for preparing food and self-defence. In the modern day, these small knives are tucked into the kilt hose. Allegedly, this tradition goes back to when Highlanders entering someone's home would leave the rest of their weapons at the door and stick their knife, usually worn under the armpit, in their hose. Prior to government disarming acts after the 1715 and 1745 Jacobite risings, Highland men carried weapons with them everywhere. These typically consisted of a basket-hilted broadsword, for those who could afford one, a dirk, long dagger, and pistol. All-metal dune pistols were the most popular. In 1715, without a military occupation to enforce the law, many clans only handed in antiquated weaponry and remained heavily armed. However, after the 45, the clan system was dismantled by British government legislation and agricultural change. The warrior culture of cattle raiding and feuding ended with it. Only the gentry and licensed drovers, along with soldiers of course, were permitted to bear arms. In the British Army, Scottish broadswords saw service in various imperial wars during the 18th century. By the 19th century, only officers continued wearing swords, and later they were reserved for purely ceremonial purposes. The scian dubh is the only surviving remnant of weaponry still regularly worn as a part of civilian Highland dress.